Hello, everyone. Welcome to day number 2 of the 21st Oak Knoll Fest, which is actually the first virtual Oak Knoll Fest. Today is actually concludes our talks for the Oak Knoll Fest. However, just as a reminder, we also do have a virtual book fair, which will be lasting until 8 p.m. tomorrow, Saturday, October 30th. And we hope that you have had some fun so far browsing around online. I will say personally, I find the images of all the books and all the booths to be absolutely spectacular. All of the presses and artists should be very, very proud of themselves. Everything looks spectacular. So also as a further reminder, I'd like to mention that we will be recording these 2 talks today. And we will be editing those and posting those on our social media and our YouTube channel to be available in mid-November. Also, after the talks, we will be hosting a Q&A session by yours truly, which we had some technical issues yesterday regarding allowing people to participate not only with audio, but also with video. This time we will not have that problem. And we invite you to participate in asking our 2 speakers today questions, and we'll go from there. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers today, Melanie Mauro of Heirloom Press and Barbara Henry of Heirloom Press. First off today is Melanie. Hello, Melanie.
Hi.
Melanie Mauro is the proprietor of Heirloom Press, a private letterpress print shop founded in 2001. It has since evolved into a print shop, papermaking studio, and bookbindery. Her artist books and prints reimagine contemporary issues through the lens of historical texts and processes. Inspired by household items and objects and design historical texts about women, her works are clinical explorations of the female body and women's traditional domestic and societal roles. Her work mixes the traditional and contemporary and utilizes many processes such as handmade paper, pigmented and stenciled pulp, traditional bookbinding, lithography and letterpress printing. It also employs laser cutting, thermochromic and photochromic pigments, and non-silver photo processes. Melanie studied painting, photography, and printmaking at the Cooper Union School of Art, located in Manhattan. Painting conservation at Studio Art Centers International in Florence, Italy. And book arts and printmaking at the University of the Arts. She has exhibited in group shows across the United States and has presented artist talks to the College Book Arts Association, North American Hand Papermakers, and the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking. Her work is in the Cynthia Sears collection at the Bainbridge Island Museum, special collection libraries of numerous institutions, and held by several private collectors. She is a member of the Amalgamated Printers Association, North American Hand Papermakers, and the Fine Press Book Association. Please let me welcome Melanie Mauro. Hello, Melanie.
Hi. Well, before I get started with my presentation, I'd like to thank, of course, Aaron and Rob Fleck for Aaron Evans and Rob Fleck for inviting me to give a talk today. It's such an honor to be here. I'd also like to thank Cynthia Norse Thompson, Russell Moret, who've been really incredible mentors to me in the entire book arts family, and also Ian Kahn of Lux Mentis. So thank you guys. And I'm going to turn on my keynote presentation. All right. As Rob mentioned, my press name is Heirloom Press, and I really got started. I'm located in Easton, Pennsylvania, so it's the eastern part of Pennsylvania, not too far from Philadelphia, and not too far from New York City. I went to school in both of those cities and studied not letterpress, but other printmaking techniques. I got my first start in letterpress printing when I was in my undergrad college at Cooper Union, I took a community bookbinding course with Esther Smith of Purgatory Pie Press. And from that, she asked me to join as an intern. And that was the first taste I got of letterpress printing. I immediately fell in love with the process and eventually started to collect my own equipment. And so when it comes to letterpress, I'm mostly self-taught, but I did study a lot of other printmaking techniques like lithography, screen printing. I also studied papermaking, which really informed my processes. So I utilize many processes in my work, including letterpress, lithography, screen printing, non-silver photography, and papermaking. And so I figured I'd show you guys a sort of overview of some of the work that I've done so that you can get a sense for what processes I'm talking about. Here's a short video. So in this video, unfortunately shot on my iPhone, so it's a little skinny. You can see some of my prints and artist books. This was from my thesis show at Rosenwald Gallery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And this is in 2018. Okay, so let me introduce you to my print shop. I got started with platen presses and some handset type. So here are some press views of what my shop looks like now. I have 2 platen presses, a small tabletop poster press, a Vandercook flatbed proof press. It's a Vandercook number 4. And as you can see, I'm also a collector of lots of handset wood and metal type. I have quite a few cabinets, and yes, my floor is reinforced underneath. It is a wood floor. So in teaching myself how to set type, I did a lot of internet searching and found a letterpress community online. And eventually I became a member of the Amalgamated Printers Association, which is a letterpress printers association, and it's usually made up of a lot of hobby printers. There are some professional printers in it as well. And they're a really fantastic resource for not just sourcing equipment, but also for helping to figure out different problem-solving techniques with these older presses. As you can see, they're quite old. This is my first press that I ever had. It is a Pearl 7x11 platen press. And because they don't manufacture this equipment anymore, you know, it's good to rely on a community that can help to source parts and troubleshoot problems. However, most of my early book work was done on this platen press. And so, of course, it has size limitations and also other limitations because the Pearl press is not a very strong press compared to some of the presses that I run now. So I really focused on the handset aspect. And as I learned how to set type, I really wanted to kind of break out of the idea of making very straight lines of just handset words and sayings. And so I started really seeking out some of the earlier ways or traditional ways to do this. Here you can see me cutting rule to kind of fit into this curved typesetting device. I also started to really, as I started collecting and getting more into letterpress, I also got interested in some of the other equipment that you would find in a traditional print shop. And so this is a tabletop perforator that I restored and got pins for and like playing around with as well. You can also see in this just some small cards that I made on my platen presses, or actually I made the cards on a combination of platen and my Vandercook press, because I'm really interested in 19th century typography forms. And so this is actually a revival by virgin wood type. It's a chromatic wood type. So I was trying to sort of expand what I was doing with just handset type. Again, this is an example of playing around with wood type, which is another thing that I became really interested in collecting. So even though I have two revival faces in here, most of the wood type that I own and that I work with is late 1800s, early 1900s. And here's an image of this poster that I made for a letterpress print exchange that includes some of the mix of old and new typefaces, or old and new makes of earlier typefaces, sort of playing on the idea of the circus handbills from the late 1800s. So another thing that I'm really interested in is paper making. And I do work a lot with handmade paper. In fact, most of my artist books and prints utilize all paper that I've made myself. And during the beginning of the pandemic, I had really grand ideas for a new artist book edition. And those plans really started to fall apart because I relied on community print shops and community papermaking facilities to sort of augment my own print shop here. And so I wasn't able to make paper or finish my paper edition for my books. So I had to really spend a lot of time over the past year building my own paper making studio. So, like many people who rely on community facilities, resources were closed for months. Some of my resources are just now getting back to normal. And that's really been a challenge with producing new work. So I did add this beautiful 5-pound Reina beater and also some vintage molds and decals. And this is one of the new mold and decals that I acquired this year. And it came with this fantastic watermark, which I'm going to leave in my work. So from here on out, you'll see you'll see this watermark in my prints and books of this size. Additionally, I do bookbinding. So for my artist book editions, I hand sew the book editions. And so this is just an example of some of the bindery tools that I have that I use for my artist books. This is one of my sewing frames. And I also have, of course, finishing presses. Because I do use a lot of leather bindings in my work. So let's talk about handset type, which is one of my favorite topics. It's something that really interests me, and this is really what drove me to start working in letterpress. So one of the first things that I acquired with my print shop and really fascinated me was the alpha blocks, which are these modular, it's a modular typeface. And so you can see behind this little postcard that I made for my alpha blocks, they have different forms that you can piece together and create letter forms. And building these letter forms was incredibly interesting because it helped me to break out of this very strict line of words format that is so common in letterpress or traditional letterpress hand setting. Again, I found some inspiration with the Purgatory Pie Press. I did take a course with Dico Faust of Purgatory Pie Press, and he's an incredible resource for breaking out of this very square mold. And so he introduced me to the circular chase, which he made. And so I played around with it and experimented in a class of his to make this image that really does not look like a very square letterpress print. He also gave me some ideas about doing sort of modified work and turn on some of my prints so that I could overprint and change the format of things that I was printing without necessarily changing the form. And that was an idea that really has kind of intrigued me and stuck with me to this day. This is another example using some really decorative 19th century ornaments, something that I'm also very much in love with. And so I made this sort of plaid card out of these ornaments by overprinting and switching directions as I printed. Another person who really inspired me with building type forms and changing how I thought about building type forms, Jen Farrell of Star Shaped Press, and I know that she's also exhibiting here at Oak Knoll along with Purgatory Pie Press. She's really a pioneer currently of making these incredible forms out of ornaments. And so I took a course with her at Wells College, a summer course. And so I played around with building type forms using 12-point ornaments, I believe. This is another form that I made in Jen Farrell's class. I wanted to do a little homage to Ebbets Field and sort of do a portrait of the stadium out of different rule and ornaments that were held at Wells. And so while those courses really helped me to build my printing skills, I don't think that I really found my own voice in this type of work. And so once I figured out how to, because I was really interested in sort of the technicality of building type forms, once I kind of figured those things out and felt that I understood them, I felt like I needed to find something more meaningful to explore in letterpress. Because I absolutely love antique and vintage typography, I didn't want to just kind of become a commercial print shop and make birthday cards and holiday wishes, although I do that, for my friends and family. It wasn't really a meaningful expression, a meaningful artistic expression for me. And so I felt like I needed to kind of push myself beyond reviving a nostalgic form of printing just for its own sake. And that brought me to the University of the Arts. I enrolled in grad school at their book arts and print program in late 2016. And it really kind of changed my thinking about using processes just for the sake of using those processes. So this image was taken at the University of the Arts. They have a really well-appointed letterpress print shop in the undergrad and graduate program. So I was playing around with some of their older typefaces because this is something that's always been of interest to me. I started digging through all of their typecases to find the oldest type that they had. And so I stumbled upon this idea of using their type to build a sort of modified handbill. And this I really think is, even though it was just me sort of playing around with their metal type, it really was kind of the genesis of some of my artist books and prints, because I decided to use these typefaces, which were very late 19th century, to reimagine a Civil War recruitment poster for men of color. It's a really famous poster from 1863 that I think probably a lot of people on the Zoom meeting have seen before. But I wanted to kind of give it a twist because at the time, it was late summer, early fall of 2016. The Democratic National Committee was in Philadelphia. Hillary Clinton was their was the Democratic Party person running for president. And so there was a lot of talk in the air on the news about women's role in every facet of life. And so this really caused me to have a lot of self reflection and thinking about place and voice for women. So these cards were one of my first assignments for my grad program. And these quotes are from a famous feminist named Lucy Stone. She did this speech about women's place in society, and it's a text that I had been working with and thinking about for a really long time. I'm also an educator, and so I used to use this text with my high school students to sort of analyze meaning and things like that. So it's always been a favorite text of mine. But I kind of fell back on using this in my art because one of my first assignments was to make a site specific installation piece. And that was such a terrifying prospect for me because, I'm usually in the print shop sort of behind the curtain. And so making something site specific where I had to go out into the real world with my art was just really horrifying. But on the other hand, I thought I need to really push myself and make this happen because I need to push myself beyond what I'm comfortable with. So I scouted a pastry shop in the neighborhood and I got permission to display my hand set letterpress cards in their cupcake case. And so the card's text sort of challenged the idea of a woman's place in society, that of being a homemaker and a stay at home wife. And this was a shot of the installation. So anyone who was coming into the store to buy cupcakes and cookies would see these sort of feminist cards in the cupcake case, sort of staring out at them. Then I started experimenting with wood type. And so I'm combining some of the things that I learned about overprinting and sort of shifting text and overprinting. And so the printing experiments are sort of combined with these reprimands that I think are pretty common for women and girls to hear about their behavior, certainly things that I've heard in my lifetime. And so I wanted to use overprinting and shifts in text to make a visual representation of what these words sort of felt like to me. And this was also the beginning of my using different voices in my work. So the examples here, don't be so loud, stop acting crazy, you're getting too emotional. These are all examples of the voice of an authority figure, a male voice, sort of reprimanding. And I wanted to kind of figure out, like, where did this come from? Why? I wanted to start researching why acting crazy or being overly emotional were criticism commonly leveled at women. And so that brings me to one of my first artist books that I made. Oh, here you can also see sort of an idea board. I wanted to just put this up because I like to pin up sort of type experiments, drawing experiments, and things that I either really am interested in visually or conceptually. Okay, all disease. This, when I started working on this artist book, I was experimenting with inkblot images and what they evoke and represent. So I thought that the idea of these Rorschach inkblots, which diagnose the mental state of the subject based on associations that they make with the shapes, would be a really rich subject to start to explore. Additionally, I started looking at 18th and 19th century medical texts at the Library Company of Philadelphia so that I could really understand what the I wanted to understand, I guess, the beginning of this diagnosis of hysteria in women, among other medical diagnoses that were specific to issues of womanhood having a uterus. And I was stunned by some of the language that was used to describe these medical cases. So this is actually an inkblot that I made. It was a random inkblot, but it really looked like a uterus to me. So I thought this is pretty amazing. I definitely need to use this image somehow in my work. It's overprinted on paper where you can see watermarks in the background. And here are some other examples of the inkblot imagery. So the title "All Disease" actually comes from an 18th century medical text that that stated, quote, "On account of the uterus, woman is all disease." And so the implication being that insanity, frivolity, unchecked emotion, these are all essential and irrevocable traits of every woman. Another thing that I really wanted to show, this is a spread from the finished book. Um, One of the traits that I wanted to show in here, because I made all the paper by hand and created watermarks and pulp painting and that sort of thing, I wanted to kind of play around with the weight, translucence, and composition of the ink blots. And so so some of the paper-made forms are kind of in contrast to the darkness of the printed forms. These forms are made with photolithography. And so once I make the ink blot, then I create a film that I shoot onto a photolitho plate, and then those are all hand inked and printed onto handmade paper. So here you can see several layers at once. You're seeing pelvic, you're seeing some of the watermarks, you're seeing some of the image of this ink blot on my right, and another ink blot below. And the lines of text sort of run off the edges of the page to kind of evoke this idea of the crazy woman or the hysterical woman. By binding them through the center, I'm trying to juxtapose these ink blots with each other to create new associations, but also to kind of disjoint you from seeing a full image until you get to the centerfold of each section. So by combining these images of pelvic bones, which were also sourced from 19th century medical texts, I think one of these images was actually taken from an earlier 18th century medical text. I'm sort of evoking these ideas that the ink blots themselves become uteruses or genitalia or other things that or some kind of stain or something other than just an ink blot image. The materials are layered to create newer imagery, but I'm also working with the idea of association. So associations that people make with the ink blots, associations that you're making between ink blots and other imagery within the book. This spread I really love because you really get a sense for several layers of the book at once, which is something that I really wanted to play with. You can kind of see the edge of a pelvic bone on the verso of one of my pages. You can see a lithograph. You can see the watermarks. You can see the translucency of the paper, which was made by overbeating abaca and overbeating cotton. And then underneath that, you see more lithographs. So, so in doing that, I'm trying to make an example of the integration of image and gutter to recreate reflections throughout the book, and that way, just as the Rorschach tests were designed to do, the viewer is making their own associations. So it plays on the idea that one's mental state is diagnosable by what is seen in these Rorschach forms. So the watermarks also help to reveal and obscure um, pieces of the form from behind the page. So text is obscured as it runs off the edge, the deckled edge of the paper. You can kind of see that here. Um, and the text is varied, and they're all from the medical journals that say variations of on account of the uterus, woman is all disease, or divided from herself and her fair judgment. So this form is a symmetrical form that was originally an ink blot, and I created a laser cut decal and used pulp painting to create the end pages for each of my book. So the form itself is made out of paper. I pulled a sheet of paper with a custom cut decal, and then behind it is another page that has pulp painting on top of that. And here's a close-up of the text that you can see on one of my pages. So this book was created at the University of the Arts in the spring of 2017. I also used some text from Shakespeare's Hamlet because that play has a lot of interesting ideas about Ophelia, who kind of goes crazy over love and then ends up dying. And so I thought some of the ways that characters were speaking of her really fit into the patterns that I was seeing in the medical texts. And that is why I chose to use that to give it more of a um, I don't know, I love the flowery language of the literature, but it was also very similar to the medical text that I was reading. So here's the bindery process. So I did sew these at home, and so here you can see some of the process of the binding. Um, the book was hand sewn using a modified medieval structure on raised cords. And I love this binding because not only is it very strong, but I really love the materials and the labor of making this book. I think they all contribute to the history that I'm trying to evoke with the printed art in this book. The binding is inspired by old incunables that I was able to study firsthand at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And also, I was able to look at some of the William Morris Kelmscott Press editions that revived this tradition of the incunable. And I was able to see those in person at Temple University's Special Collections Library. Both of those places are incredible resources for research and for looking at these objects. Here you can see the sections kind of coming together. It's a pretty sizable book. A lot of the books that I made in the very beginning were quite small, and I wanted to make something that sort of was large enough to kind of let you fall into it. so So this book measures about 15, maybe a little bit more, 15 inches by 22, 23 when open. And here's a close-up as I'm sewing the signature. You can see that I'm folding the lithograph in half and binding it on the edge. The binding for this book is a quarter leather with marbled paper that I made. And I wanted to use really dark grays and black marbling inks on black paper to give it this really sort of Gothic feel. Unfortunately, it doesn't photograph as clearly as I'd like, but I was really pleased with that randomness and texture that the marbling process gives to these papers. So that brings me to specimens, which is a print installation that I created around the same time. So here's a large view of the installation. Um, these prints were all made on handmade paper. The print installation is called Specimen and has been exhibited in a variety of formats. So this view actually contains 19 framed images. 16 of them are calotype prints that are overprinted with with a screen print image. And they're all on handmade paper. And then the remaining 3 images, which you can see are the lighter colors with the gray ghostly forms in the center. Um, those are those are just made from handmade paper. Um, the paper is pigmented and layered, and I use a technique called the blowout, which I'll get into in a little bit. Um, and here's sort of a side view where you can see the expanse of the installation a little bit clearer. This image is a view of a single calotype print on handmade paper with a screen print overlay. So the calotype is it's a non-silver photo process similar to cyanotype. It was invented in the 1880s. The chemistry produces these deep, rich browns that you can kind of see around the image. They're kind of browns to black, so it's a pretty dark color, and you can get pretty saturated with with this process. The screen print is photochromic ink. And so what that means is it's translucent and colorless until it's exposed to UV light when it begins to illuminate. And so the chandelier image that's overprinted turns a warm pink tone. So here's an example of that change. So as I'm exposing it to sunlight or UV light, the color darkens and it becomes this really warm pink. And this is an image that I took to show what it looks like exposed to daylight or natural light with the UV light. So the idea behind specimens is that it's a collection of prints, each one a separate specimen of womanhood. So using the idea of the ink blot as a window into the minds of women, I wanted to pair each ink blot with a domestic object to create a collection of unique symmetrical archetypes, each in its own case, each one framed, evoking the Victorian interest in cataloging and possessing. So I kind of like this Victorian idea of the specimen, and so I wanted to make each one its own unique specimen. So the inkblot shape is bisected by this screen printed vessel, and so I'm drawing parallels not just between the concepts of the domestic objects and the inkblot forms, but also in some of the shapes. So this is a little bit of a closer view of the calotype print. You can see the nuances of the light and dark that as it's exposed to the light, especially in the edges. And I really loved the definition of the rich browns of the calotype chemistry. Here at the top, you can see it's a little bit warmer. So So here are just some examples. And while I'm using some of the same inkblot images, and sometimes I use the same object form, which they're kind of modified silhouettes. I always pair them differently. So each print in the collection is a unique print. This calotype is exposed to kind of give an additional visual texture to the background. I was playing with the positive and negative spaces because I wanted it to be a little more muddled than some of the others. I didn't want each print to be uh, easily reproducible and exactly the same. So as I was editioning some of these prints, I wanted to vary the way that they were exposed and the way that they would look um, when they were washed out. So the result is a slightly oxidized luster effect around the edges of the image, and I kind of liked the idea that doing this would sort of play with the positive and negative of the photochemistry. And also this kind of gives the calotype a very similar visual quality to the next image, which is a paper making technique and not a printing technique. So this vessel is created by using a paper making technique called a blowout. The way that this was made is several sheets of paper are cooched together. That just means pressed one on top of the other. And then I used a stencil um, and then gently sprayed water through the stencil to wash away layers of the paper that I cooched together. And as that happened, you start to see the gray layer in between the white layer. And then I had an abaca sheet on the bottom, which is translucent. So I used different fibers, I used different pigments to make the different layers of this piece of paper. And what results is this ghostly form, which I really loved the processes, because the processes are old, but also because I'm trying to evoke a historical moment in time. I like the idea of having this image appear to be a little bit ghostly. Um, this slide just shows the layout of the installation in progress before framing. I just wanted to get a sense of the flow of images across such a large expanse in a gallery setting. And because it's really difficult to find a space that has that much room that you would find in a gallery, I sort of had to lay them out on my floor to take a look at all of them. But here you can see some of them together and how I imagine them working together on a wall space. Okay. This artist book is called Wagging His Finger at Her. Um, and actually, I'll get into how I named this book because that was the last thing that I did when working on this book. This is a really small in size book. It's only 7 inches by 5 inches when closed. So this is the smallest book that I've made so far. I was fortunate enough one summer to earn a scholarship to Penland School of Crafts for a summer session, and that's where I made this edition. It's a hardcover pamphlet bound book with a letterpress printed cloth cover, and I created the whole edition in 2 weeks. So from idea to finished product, it was kind of a whirlwind. So it's that there's a reason for the small size of the book. I also had to fit it in my suitcase to bring it back home. Here's a nice example of the open book. So the text in this book is entirely taken from Ibsen's A Doll's House, which I was reading at the time. And as you can see, there's a text that's really mostly the husband's dialogue to his wife, and that's on a line on each page in the center. So in doing this, I wanted to create a dialogue between the vessels that I illustrated and made into polymer plates. They are overprinted because I wanted to maintain this pale candy color of each of these vessels. And but I also wanted to give them depth and texture. So to do this, I made a silhouette of each of my drawings. And then I also did a line drawing for each of them. And then I registered them and overprinted it in the same translucent ink color. So here's an example where you can see this yellow sort of candy dish shape that I made. So the pale yellow is the same pale yellow that I used for the line work They're just registered together. So when they overprint, it makes a deeper color of that yellow color. And here's an example of the blue. I just love that effect. And when I was doing my ink tests and I printed those, I was just totally excited by this process of being able to just overprint, because initially I thought I might use like a different ink or like a black outline, which is pretty traditional to do in illustration. But it was too harsh and too dark. And so discovering this overprinting was really, it kind of hit the spot that I was going for. So these are some of the prints that I did to make my dummy book. I always make a dummy book with my test prints so that I can see how they're going to fit together and work together. And as you can see, the vessels are bisected through the centerfold when bound, but I wanted them to really line up with each other so that you would have this continuity throughout the book. So even though you have different forms, you have this connection. And so this is what I mean by that. If you look at this image, you see the base of the candy dish and the base of the covered vessel align. And so I wanted to, even though they're different forms and they have different shapes and they end in different, they don't have a perfect symmetry, I did want there to be some kind of connection and continuity that had held them all together. The text is hand set from Penland's collection. So in this slide, you can see the downside of using community type. I have a lot of things that I had to sort of circle and fix and play around with the make ready. But I proofed all of the lines before printing them onto the pages of the vessel images. So it took a little while to get everything to work together, but it did. The other thing that you can see here is that I have most of my text is an italic text, but I have 2 lines at the top that are not italicized, and that is because I used the italicized text for the husband's voice, and then the centerfold image is the main character Nora's voice, where she kind of stands up for herself. So here we can see some of the husband's text. Is that my little squirrel bustling about? Has my little spendthrift been wasting money again? He sort of trivializes her and says, that is like a woman. And I just loved having that come after her standing up for herself in the center page, where she says, they all think I'm incapable of anything really serious, that I have gone through nothing in this world of cares. Having him say that is like a woman after this statement just kind of sums up a lot of experiences that I've had. So the centerfold uses a pelvic image that I illustrated from an 18th century medical text on midwifery. And I wanted to pair that with the glass vessels. And so this image shows, oops. Well, I had an image that showed how it aligned with one of the green vessels in the candy dish. Apologies for that. I must have skipped a slide. That brings me to Curio. This artist book recalls Victorian specimen collections and wonder cabinets. And so I wanted to give you a sense for how I developed my color palette. Because I'm using a lot of household objects with their inkblot doppelgangers to create these mirror images, I wanted to sort of imagine women as domestic curators in their own gilded cages. And so this image, this inspiration for colors of translucent inks came from my collection of Depression glass and Carnival glass. And I've always been fascinated by the colors and patterns of early 20th century glassware. And so that collection that I have really informed the imagery in this artist book. These are some drawdowns. So these spreads are showing some of the different colors and text in the book. And this sort of some of the text that I've used, which I'm using a text from Kate Chopin's The Awakening, and also womenly advice books from the 1880s. And so I wanted to contrast the women's voice and the man's voice in this book. I sort of got some inspiration when I made the Penland book to build on that idea with this larger edition. So the italicized text in this is the woman's voice. This text or this slide is showing how I paired some of my ink blots that I made with the household objects. So I'm trying to have a similarity in shape or some other quality. I felt that the ink blot in the top two images really reflected the luminosity and reflective qualities of the candlestick, the brass candlestick. And I also liked how the flow of the form in the vase and the chandelier was sort of reflected by the ink blots. So these are the actual ink images. And then this is I turn these into films for the photolitho process. So the light and dark balance has to be exaggerated in order to get those details to hold up over the process of printing lithography. And so I just wanted to show you a little bit of that process in these next few slides. In this image, you can see the plate contrasted with a print from that plate. So here is the finished lithograph with a letterpress printed image of a tureen. And here we have a lithograph printed on really translucent paper that is sort of bisected with the binding, and then beyond it you can see some of the letterpress printed imagery. This image is made by combining letterpress printed imagery with a translucent sheet that has white cotton cooched onto it. And I've also included thermochromic screen prints. And what this image is showing is the paper made chandelier image, and the inkblot is made with a screen print. Thermochromic means that the ink is reactive to heat. And so when you have warm hands and you touch it, it goes from black to white. Some of those images I put on the edge of the book so that as you touch them, as you page through the book, you have to touch it. And that was done purposely to kind of contrast these variations in tone in the lithograph with the variations in tone that you get from touching the image. And I think that the thermochromic ink, I like the idea of having a book that is sensitive and reactive to the viewer's touch, because it involves the reader, the viewer, in such a way that makes them complicit in the interpretation of the artwork in a physical way. So the text that inspired using the thermochromic ink was from The Awakening, and it says, "What folly to bathe at such hour in such heat!" exclaimed Mr. Pontellier. "You are burnt beyond recognition," he added, looking at his wife as one looks at a valuable piece of personal property which has suffered some damage. So this idea that she got a sunburn, which, by the way, is also reversible. The thermochromic prints in this, after you touch them and they cool off, they do return to black. So it's not a permanent change. And this is just some of the custom decals that I made, and I used a laser, I created a laser cut plastic form that I would tape in over top of my mold and decal so that I could get those forms when I pulled a sheet. And then those sheets are cooched on top of a translucent base sheet. as you can see in this image and this image. So the pulp is overbeaten cotton and shaped by the decal and then cooched onto the abaca, so that the effect when it dries is you have a white image on a transparent sheet. And so when I bind them into the section, you can see through that abaca sheet to what I have printed behind it, whether it's text or another image. And there you're making connections between the two images that you're seeing at one time. So this entire edition was bound on alum-talled goatskin. And again, I used raised cord binding. So you can see the grain, which I really love, of the skin. And here you can see the sewn end bands. So I'll really briefly go through some of the new work that I have. And a lot of this is process because I'm still in the process of completing this work. So this set of slides shows mostly process photos. My next artist book, which is called Decorum, and as I've mentioned before, it has suffered some setbacks in editioning because of the pandemic. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, many community facilities closed to the public. And so like many artists, I had limits on what I could produce at home. And because almost all of my work incorporates my own handmade paper, because I love to control weight, color, fiber, translucency, and because I also incorporate pulp imagery, as you can see here, and watermarks, it was really difficult to get this edition off by myself without any community shops to work out of. So since the closures, I started building my own papermaking facilities. And so here you can see some of my pulp painting processes using stencils, pigmented cotton pulp, and abaca sheets. So this shows that I have a really small stencil that I used repeatedly on one piece of paper to create a mandala image. So when dried, the paper is the weight and translucency of really thin, like vellum paper or tracing paper, and then the decoration will be opaque white. So these next few images that show like a cobalt blue mandala, these are also forms that are stenciled onto translucent abaca sheets. The blue pulp is pigmented with cobalt water-based pigments. And I used a variety of values of blue to get these forms. My new edition is called Decorum, but it is based on some of the blue flow pottery or flow blue pottery. And so I wanted to kind of evoke that pleating edge with the paper that I'm making. And here you can sort of see how some of that blue pigment bleeds into the chain lines of the paper. I'm also, the other reason why I really enjoy working with handmade paper is because I can emboss in the cotton sheet during the pressing and drying stages of paper making. And so these forms, the embossment in these forms is way stronger than what could be done with pressure printing or letterpress printing. And then finally, this shows a detail of a cyanotype print. And this piece will incorporate domestic patterns and ornaments throughout the work. And this detail shows part of the mandala design that will be bound together with translucent pulp painted sheets. Thank you very much. I really appreciated the opportunity. And so I'll turn it over to Rob and take any questions.
Well, thank you, Melanie. Really appreciate it. That was great. I did want to make one comment. It's like I do definitely think that more bakeries should incorporate local art more so, at least from what they actually do. Our local one right down here does do a very good job of incorporating local art from local artists in the area. So that's pretty cool. But they don't put the artwork in the actual glass cases, which now
Uh-huh.
you've gotten me to kind of recommend. So, just wanted to make that quick comment. Well, I do have a question. And it's kind of a two-part question, but the first one is, what is the general layout of your studio? You're kind of like a jack of all trades, not only a printmaker and a printer, but also a paper maker and a binder. So that it requires a lot of equipment. So I was actually just curious about the layout of your studio, if they're separate studios or if they're one larger studio that incorporates um, all three departments. But if you can just expand on that, that would be really interesting.
So the bindery equipment, because it's mobile, I can kind of do that anywhere. Um, they're just sort of small, easily carryable pieces. A sewing frame, I can just set up at a table wherever. The book presses, I kind of lean them against a wall once I use them. The letterpress equipment is on a first floor space, so it's totally separate from paper making, which is in the basement space. And those are both in my house. So basically, what would be a normal person's living room and dining room is my print shop, and then the basement is completely dedicated to paper making. So all of the water, because with paper making, there's a lot of water. It's in a place that I can easily clean it up and drain and that sort of thing. So they're totally separate. My drying space is also in the basement, but it's away from the water part. So yeah, I've done a really job of turning my entire house into an artist space.
Awesome. Well, also I mean, obviously your credentials are impressive, obviously, but I assume that you had learned how to do hand paper making and bookbinding, maybe starting at the University of the Arts, or was there another institution that you started to learn that from?
Well, I actually, so I did my undergrad at Cooper Union, and Cooper Union School of Art is a really unique, or was a really unique art school. I mean, it still is. We didn't have to declare a major, so even though I went into it really starting to learn painting techniques and that sort of thing, that's where I was introduced to first lithography, and then screen printing, paper making, and because I was really interested in artist books. That's where I took my community bookbinding. It was really the bookbinding that I learned back then was really just sewing without adhesive, so non-adhesive binding, and that's what I did with Purgatory Pie Press. So I learned a lot from Esther, just one-on-one, but also in a community space. And so I really got my start with all of those things as an undergrad. But I also did things like learning traditional, like Renaissance Italian painting techniques, how to grind my own pigments, and that led me to study conservation later in Florence. I also learned a lot of Japanese paper making and binding techniques as an undergrad, more so than Western paper. So the Western paper I was really introduced to in grad school, but I started all of that um, way before I got into letterpress. And so a lot of those things then inform my practice as a self-taught letterpress printer and then in grad school.
Okay, thank you. We have a message from Carolyn Shankel. Welcome, Carolyn. She says, thank you for this presentation. And her question is, what spurred your inclusion of the process of incorporating papermaking processes into the reader's experience of the narrative? I love your use of UV sensitive ink and layering of paper to create your translucent images.
Huh. Well, I mean, I guess that really speaks to why I like making artist books in the first place. I I've always loved books since I was a really little kid. I mean, I remember when I was in maybe second grade making my own versions of books and stapling together pieces of paper. And there's something that's just so sort of immersive and intimate about sitting with a book that you really don't get when you're looking at paintings on a wall. And I'm not knocking those visual art experiences because I love all of them. But for me, working in a book format, it just has a really, I don't know, it just resonates with me especially. And, you know, the thing that's interesting about me is that I want to consider all aspects of the book. I love paper making, and I love the versatility of making my own processes, and making my own, using different fibers and what you can do. And so I think that it's important to, when using those kinds of materials, really use them for what they can do. And so, working with pulp painting, working with translucency, if I have the ability to do that, and that's going to augment the experience or augment the meaning that I'm trying to convey, then I'm glad to be able to do it. I do have a lot of interests. I mean, I'm really interested in photography. I'm really interested in painting. So I sort of, I think I kind of owe that to Russell um, Moret. He sort of, because when I started out, I was like, what can I do with letterpress? And he's like, don't think about it that way. Think about what do you want to do and how you can make it happen. And
Exactly.
so then I thought, yeah, I know how to do a lot of different things. So why not use these different things to create work? And so I kind of approach my work that way now.
Excellent. Okay. Well, Melanie, thank you so much for your lovely talk. Very
Yeah.
and very very lucky to have you on. And Melanie is also exhibiting in the Oak Knoll Fest this year. So her and Barbara actually. So anyway, thank you so much, Melanie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This was a real honor and a pleasure.